For the Federal Reserve, the weapon of choice in the fight against inflation has been an onslaught of rate hikes and a relentlessly hawkish tone when addressing Congress. Investors, on the other hand, don't necessarily have the same tools available to them to fight inflation and are left with cost cutting and coupon clipping and downsizing as the best courses of action to combat rising prices. While frugality in retirement may help you and your finances battle inflation, you're going to need a lot more than penny pinching to win the war. And that's what I want to discuss today, the different strategies that investors can use in retirement to fight inflation. Take any sport, whether it's basketball, baseball, softball, whatever it is. In order to be successful in that sport, you have to play both offense and defense, right? Too much of one and not enough of the other will likely result in defeat. I mean, just imagine going on the basketball court and dribbling the ball, and instead of trying to score, you just hand the ball over to the defense. It's not going to work, right? The same is true with personal finance, specifically in addressing the issue of inflation in retirement. Unfortunately, the media tends to focus too much on defensive strategies, like cutting back on things, and not nearly enough on the offensive. Consider a recent article from the Wall Street Journal where they talk about giving up breakfast every morning to save money on egg prices. If you do something like that, obviously you'll save a little bit of money in your budget by cutting back on breakfast expenses, but you also might be depriving your body of valuable nutrients that in turn could negatively impact your quality of life. Also, who wants to give up breakfast every morning? Successfully counteracting the effects of inflation in retirement can only be achieved by using a financial playbook that is complete with both offensive and defensive strategies. And before I go into the strategies today, I just want to emphasize that it is very important. Anything I discuss today is going to be pretty much irrelevant to you without a financial plan. The reason for that is a financial plan is absolutely essential in helping you make informed decisions today, despite the uncertainty of tomorrow. For example, let's just take the topic of inflation. If inflation is running higher than expected, let's say for the next 5 years, a carefully crafted financial plan is going to help you determine what, if any, of the strategies that we discussed today you might have to implement to prepare for those rising costs in the future. If you don't have a financial plan, I'd recommend getting one established or working with a professional to help get you started. So let's just get right into it. I want to focus today on offensive strategies, and in part 2, I will discuss defensive strategies. So let's start with the offensive strategies, and I'm going to go over 3. So let's start with number 1. Start a side business to generate additional income. Now, you may decide to quit working when you retire, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your income has to stop. And studies have actually shown that majority of investors who are entering retirement still want to do some kind of work. It might be part-time, it might be consulting, or it might be in a venture that's totally different than how they've spent their career. The reality is people want to be stimulated. They want to be mentally fit, and they understand the importance of working towards something. According to a recent article from Entrepreneur magazine, retirees are now earning upwards of $20,000 per month working one fully remote side job. Now, those figures might be a little bit inflated. That survey could have been done for people working, let's say, in Silicon Valley or New York City or something like that, where the cost of living is much higher. But you get the idea, right? Cut that figure in half or reduce it substantially. You're still at, $100,000 to $120,000 a year working fully remote. Now, even if you don't want to, let's say, exert any more of your mental energy on the type of work and the job that you retired from, you've likely acquired a set of skills and knowledge that can be shared with others and monetized. Remember, stocks, bonds, real estate, those aren't the only assets that can support your living expenses in retirement. Your intangible assets, i.e., your experience, your knowledge, and your skill set can be valuable untapped resources to consider using in retirement with or without inflation. And I go into further detail on setting up a side business and tapping your intangible assets in my blog, if you want to read it, at oneupfinancial.com/blog. Number 2, offensive strategy number 2, use your investments wisely. So what do I mean by that? Over the past 100 years or so, stocks have trounced bonds by a wide margin. But in order to realize that significant outperformance, you need to allow for sufficient time in the market, right? Stocks don't always go up 8 to 9% in a straight line every single year. We have fluctuations up, and like we saw in 2022, we have fluctuations down. Cash, CDs, short-term bonds, and other cash-like alternatives carry a lower rate of return than stocks do. And as such, you'll want to consider tapping those safe assets first in retirement to allow ample time for your equities or your stocks to grow and surpass the rate of inflation. Just think about it for a moment. Let's just say the stock market averages about 8% a year, and bonds comparatively are returning approximately 4% a year. By using your bond bucket, if you will, your safe bucket, if you will, first to fund living expenses, then you're in a sense kind of saving 4%, right? You're letting your stocks grow long-term at 8% while you're using the ones that are growing only at 4%. To expand on this concept a little bit, you might even consider looking at a home equity line of credit, or HELOC, to counter the effects of inflation. While the current rates aren't favorable at the moment, they were not too long ago, and it's very likely that rates will come down at some point in the future. So I'll give you a quick example of how this could work. Let's say you borrow on a home equity line of credit at 4%. And you do that instead of taking money out of your balanced portfolio that has averaged about 6% per year. By doing that, even though you're borrowing and you're increasing debt against your home, you're still 2% ahead, right? Because you're letting your assets within your IRA, your investment account, grow at 6%, and you're borrowing at 4%, so you're actually 2% ahead. Not to mention the fact that you don't have to sell any of your investments and incur taxes on capital gains or IRA distributions. And that same concept can be further applied to your brokerage account or a portfolio line of credit that is secured with your brokerage account. So it's kind of just like another source, another line of credit that's available to you, not tied to your home like a home equity line of credit, but tied to your portfolio. Again, this all assumes that the rates are favorable. Lastly, the third offensive strategy is implement tax savings strategies. Now, remember, it's not about what you earn in retirement, but rather what you keep. The higher your after-tax return, the more money you'll have available to cover the rising costs of goods and services. And here are just a few tax-saving strategies that you can implement in your plan today to put more cash in your pocket. Number 1 is asset location, not to be confused with asset allocation. If you have a mix of, let's say, taxable accounts, tax-deferred accounts like IRAs, and tax-free accounts like Roth IRAs, asset location involves strategically placing assets in each of those accounts to optimize your after-tax returns. And best way to illustrate this, I think, is with an example. So let's say that you like using actively managed mutual funds. Well, instead of putting those actively managed mutual funds, investing those in, let's say, your brokerage account, you might instead use your actively managed funds in your IRA or your Roth IRA. And the reason for that is actively managed funds kick out capital gain distributions. And if those are sitting in a brokerage account, then you're going to pay tax on that. If they're sitting in an IRA, you won't pay tax on that. That's the idea of asset location. That's just one example of ways that you can strategically place your assets in different types of accounts. Number 2, tax loss harvesting. I've spoken and written ad nauseum about this, but it is very effective. And the short of it is selling an investment and realizing the loss, and then taking the proceeds and investing that into something comparable, thereby taking that loss and utilizing it as a deduction on your tax return while still remaining invested in the stock market. It's a very effective tool, and I recommend everyone consider using it. Number 3 is municipal bonds. Now, not saying that you have to use municipal bonds, but more so pay attention to what's called the tax equivalent yield. And the tax equivalent yield is going to tell you the yield that you're going to need in a taxable bond in order to get the equivalent yield on a municipal bond. For example, let's say your federal tax rate is 33% and you live in the state of Pennsylvania. If you have a municipal bond that's yielding 3.9%, that's going to give you a better after-tax return than a U.S. Treasury bond paying 5%. So it's very important to pay close attention to that tax equivalent yield in retirement. Number 4 is use your HSA. Obviously, you have to have it in HSA to do this, but if you have one, definitely use it. That's because distributions used to cover qualifying health-related expenses are exempt from federal tax. And further, if you've kept good records of medical expenses paid out of pocket in the past, then you can use your HSA to reimburse yourself and still pay no tax. So, for example, let's say that you had a knee surgery done 3 years ago that cost $5,000 that you just paid with your debit card. You can actually reimburse yourself today in retirement that $5,000 from your HSA, and that distribution will be tax-free to you. Last tax saving strategy is qualifying charitable distributions. So if you give money to a charity every year, if you have an IRA and you're taking or are about to take required minimum distributions, then consider setting up what's called qualified charitable distributions. By donating to a charity directly from your IRA instead of, let's say, your checking account, your RMDs, your required minimum distributions, will become tax-free to you. Now, you won't get any deduction for your charitable donations, but the majority of taxpayers don't itemize. They take the standard deduction. So they likely won't benefit anyways from making those charitable contributions. So to summarize, 3 offensive strategies for fighting inflation in retirement. Number 1, start a side business to generate additional income. Number 2, use your investments wisely. And number 3, implement tax saving strategies. And in part 2, I'm going to go over 3 defensive strategies for fighting inflation. So stay tuned.